There is a clay document in the Ashmolean Museum that records something extraordinary about the order of civilization. The Sumerian King List, inscribed on a prism sometime around 2000 BCE, opens with a single unambiguous claim. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not Uruk, not Eridu. The list places this city before the flood sequence, before kingship moved anywhere else, at the beginning of everything. When Iraqi archaeologists excavated the site in the 1940s, they found something that made that ancient claim more complicated. They documented 18 buried layers, 18 periods of occupation, one on top of the other, each one building on what came before. The first city contained multiple cities. The site was first identified by Western archaeology in the 1850s, but the excavation that matters happened nearly a century later. In 1946, the Iraqi Department of Antiquities launched a systematic dig at Eridu, known locally as Tell Abu Shahrain, under the direction of Fuad Safar and Seaton Lloyd. Their objective was clear and methodical: excavate downward through the main mound, document every layer of occupation, and reach virgin soil. They wanted to know what the oldest city looked like at its foundation, what preceded it, and whether the Sumerian claim that this was where everything began could be confirmed archaeologically. What they found was not a single ancient city, it was a sequence. Safar and Lloyd identified 18 distinct strata at Eridu, 18 separate periods of habitation stacked vertically, each one built directly on the architectural remains of the period before it. This was not haphazard reoccupation. The layers showed continuity, intentionality, a deliberate pattern of reconstruction that spanned thousands of years. At the center of this pattern was something I find difficult to interpret as anything other than religious continuity. At every level of occupation, they found evidence of temple construction. 6 successive temples, each one built on the ruins of the previous one, each one larger, more elaborate, more architecturally sophisticated than the last. The sacred function did not move. It did not shift to a new location as the settlement grew or changed. It stayed anchored to the same patch of ground, the same sacred center, across the entire span of the site's occupation. I want to stay with that observation for a moment because I think it tells us something fundamental about what Eridu was. The Sumerian King List calls it the place where kingship descended from heaven. The archaeological record shows a site where the most important architectural effort, the central organizing structure, was the temple, rebuilt generation after generation in the same location. Whatever Eridu was in Sumerian memory, it was sacred before it was administrative. It was a religious center that became a city, not a city that acquired a temple. The excavation went deeper. Safar and Lloyd worked downward through progressively older strata, documenting construction techniques, pottery styles, and architectural forms as they changed across time. What they were uncovering was not just Sumerian urbanism. The lower layers belonged to an earlier cultural phase, the Ubaid period. The Ubaid culture predates classical Sumerian civilization. It represents the transition from small agricultural settlements to the organized irrigation-dependent communities that would eventually give rise to the first cities. The Ubaid people lived in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia, in a landscape defined by freshwater delta plains, seasonal flooding, and the complex ecology of wetlands. They fished. They cultivated early forms of irrigation agriculture. They produced distinctive pottery, and at Eridu they built temples. This is the part that complicates the standard narrative. The first Sumerian city was not founded by the Sumerians on empty land. It was built on top of an earlier Ubaid sacred site, a site that already had its own temple-building tradition, its own architectural continuity, its own pattern of religious reconstruction spanning centuries before anything we would call Sumerian arrived. The marsh landscape context matters here. Eridu, along with Uruk and developed on the margins of freshwater marshes in the Mesopotamian delta plain. UNESCO's description of these sites emphasizes their ecological setting, major urban centers emerging from a wetland environment dependent on the seasonal rhythms of water, organized around the management of irrigation and flood cycles. The early Ubaid layers at Eridu show evidence of this marsh-based economy: fishing tools, water management structures, pottery associated with wetland subsistence. The city that the Sumerian King List remembers as the first was already a place of accumulated sacred history when Sumerian culture arrived. The temple at the bottom of the sequence, the earliest structure Safar and Lloyd documented, was Ubaid, not Sumerian. The pattern of temple-on-temple reconstruction that defined Eridu's entire occupation history began before the civilization that claimed it as foundational even existed. Safar and Lloyd reached virgin soil. They documented the transition from Ubaid to Sumerian across the stratigraphic sequence. They recorded the architectural evolution of the temple complex as it grew in size and complexity. And then, after completing their work in the late 1940s, the excavation largely stopped. There have been minor follow-up studies, limited conservation efforts. A small-scale excavation program restarted in 2019, more than 70 years after Safar and Lloyd concluded their work. But the scale of modern investigation at Eridu does not match the significance the site holds in the archaeological record. The first city, the place where Sumerian texts say kingship descended from heaven, has been available for serious excavation for over 150 years. For most of that time, it has been left largely alone. I kept looking at the stratigraphic reports and thinking 18 layers. The first city already contained 18 older versions of itself, each one building on what came before, each one preserving the sacred center in the same location. What does first mean when the ground beneath it is already stratified into repeated cycles of construction, collapse, and renewal? The Sumerian King List does not say Eridu was the first settlement, it says kingship descended there. The archaeology shows that when kingship arrived, whenever that was, in whatever form Sumerian political organization took, it arrived at a location that was already sacred, already layered with older temples, already anchored in a tradition of religious architecture that preceded Sumerian urbanism by centuries. That gap in excavation activity is not incidental. 75 years is not an oversight. It is a span of time long enough that the archaeologists who worked at Eridu in the 1940s are gone, their students are retired, and the institutional memory of what was found there has faded into archival reports that most people working in Near Eastern archaeology have never read. The site has been available. The stratigraphic sequence has been documented. The questions raised by 18 layers of continuous temple construction at the location Sumerian texts call the first city have been sitting in the archaeological record for 3/4 of a century, unanswered. I needed to understand what the Sumerian King List was actually saying about Eridu, because the phrasing is specific in a way that matters. The King List does not simply place Eridu first chronologically, it places Eridu before the flood. The structure of the text is clear. Kingship descends at Eridu, a sequence of kings rules there, and then the flood comes. After the flood, kingship is re-established at different cities, Kish, then Uruk, then Ur. Eridu belongs to the pre-flood world. It is remembered as part of an older order, an earlier phase of civilization that was interrupted by catastrophe and then rebuilt elsewhere. What does it mean for a city to be remembered as pre-flood? In Mesopotamian tradition, the flood is not a minor event. It is a civilizational break, a boundary between the world that was and the world that came after. The King List preserves the memory of this break by dividing its chronology into pre-flood and post-flood dynasties. Eridu sits on the far side of that division. It is remembered as belonging to the time before. And then I looked at the 18 layers. If Eridu is pre-flood in Sumerian memory, and if the archaeological record shows 18 distinct periods of habitation at the site, what are we looking at? Are the deeper layers, the Ubaid strata, the earliest temple constructions, are those the physical remains of what Sumerian tradition remembered as the pre-flood world? I want to be careful about what I am claiming here. I am not saying the flood happened as a singular historical event that can be pinpointed in the stratigraphy. What I am saying is that the Sumerians remembered Eridu as belonging to an older world, and the archaeology shows that Eridu was indeed older than Sumerian urbanism, older than the political structures we associate with classical Mesopotamian civilization, older than the writing system that recorded the King List itself. The match is not between myth and geology, it is between myth and archaeology. The texts say this place is ancient, foundational, pre-flood. The strata say this place has 18 layers of continuous sacred occupation, starting in the Ubaid period and extending through the entire span of Sumerian civilization. Both sources, textual and material, agree that Eridu represents something older than the civilization that claimed it. The temple succession is the key. Each generation at Eridu did not simply build a new temple somewhere on the settlement. They built it on top of the old one. They preserved the location. They expanded the structure. They elaborated the architectural form, but they did not move it. The sacred geography stayed fixed. This is not accidental accumulation. This is deliberate continuity. What makes a location sacred enough to anchor that kind of multi-generational commitment? What were the people building Temple Level 6 remembering about Temple Level 1? What did they know or believe or preserve in oral tradition about why this specific patch of ground, this exact location in the marsh delta, was the place where the temple had to be? I kept thinking, the first city already contains the memory of older cities. The foundational sacred site already rests on older sacred construction. First in Sumerian tradition might not mean first settlement. It might mean oldest continuously sacred, the place where the pattern of temple building, of organized religion, of sacred architecture as the center of community life began and never stopped. Eridu is not unique in this pattern. You see the same thing at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, where successive generations built new houses directly on top of old ones, preserving the same spatial organization across centuries. You see it at Göbekli Tepe, where the earliest megalithic structures are the most architecturally sophisticated, not the most primitive, and where later occupants deliberately buried the older temples before building new ones on top. You see it at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where multiple civilizations, Israelite, Babylonian, Persian, Roman, Islamic, have built their most sacred structures on the same elevated platform across 3,000 years. The pattern is consistent. Certain locations become sacred, and once they are recognized as sacred, they remain sacred. Civilizations that have no documented contact with each other, separated by vast distances and centuries, return to the same ground generation after generation. They build upward. They layer new construction over old. They preserve the sacred center even as everything else around it changes. Why? What are they recognizing? What makes these specific locations worthy of continuous reconstruction? Is it something about the physical geography, access to water, elevation, visibility? Is it something encoded in oral tradition, passed down from earlier occupants who saw or knew or experienced something at that place that made it sacred? Or is it something else, something we do not have the framework to interpret because we no longer think about space and place the way pre-modern societies did? Eridu sits at the beginning of this pattern in the written record. It is the oldest documented example of a sacred site with continuous temple reconstruction across multiple cultural phases. The Ubaid builders started it, the Sumerians inherited it and continued it, and then, at some point in the early 2nd millennium BCE, the pattern stopped. The site was gradually abandoned, the temples were not rebuilt again, but the memory remained. The Sumerian King List, compiled centuries after Eridu's decline, still placed it first, still remembered it as the location where kingship descended, still marked it as pre-flood, ancient, foundational. The city became a ruin, the memory became a text, and the question of what made Eridu sacred in the first place, what the Ubaid builders recognized, what the Sumerian kings preserved, what 18 layers of temple construction were anchored to, remained unanswered. The question is why we are not still excavating Eridu at the scale the site demands. Why, after Safar and Lloyd reached virgin soil in the late 1940s, did the work largely stop? Why has there not been a sustained, multi-decade, internationally funded excavation program at the location Sumerian texts identify as the place where civilization began? The standard explanation points to Iraq's modern history, decades of conflict, international sanctions, the collapse of institutional infrastructure, the deliberate destruction of archaeological sites by extremist groups. The context for fieldwork in Iraq has been genuinely hostile. I am not dismissing that, the challenges are real, but Eridu is in Dhikar province in the far south of Iraq. It was not in the primary conflict zones of either Gulf War. It was not targeted by ISIS, whose campaign of archaeological destruction focused on sites in the north and west, Nimrud, Hatra, Mosul. Eridu received UNESCO World Heritage designation in 2016, a status specifically intended to provide international protection and attract research funding. A limited excavation program did restart in 2019, more than 70 years after the original work concluded. The question of why there is not a major, sustained, well-funded excavation effort at Eridu is not fully answered by pointing to regional instability. Other sites in similarly complex environments have attracted long-term research investment when the institutional will existed to make it happen. The will, in this case, has not existed at a scale that matches the significance of what Safar and Lloyd documented. Eridu is named in the foundational mythology of the civilization that gave us writing and codified law as the place where everything began. Its stratigraphic sequence shows 18 layers of continuous occupation with temple construction at every level. The deepest layers belong to the Ubaid period, predating classical Sumerian urbanism. The site represents the earliest known example of sustained sacred architecture in Mesopotamia. And for 75 years, it has been available for investigation while remaining largely untouched. I have been sitting with that gap for a long time, and I keep coming back to something uncomfortable. What if the reason Eridu has not been prioritized is not logistical complexity or funding constraints, but something harder to name, a distributed institutional preference across universities and funding agencies and archaeological departments for not finding out what is beneath the 18th layer? I am not claiming a coordinated suppression. I am not pointing to a specific actor or deliberate decision. What I am describing is more diffuse than that, a site that challenges the standard narrative of how civilization emerged, a clear record of what needs to be investigated, and a persistent generation-spanning failure to do the work. Because here is what Eridu does to the word first. If the first city already contains 18 older layers, if the foundational sacred site is built on earlier Ubaid temples, if the place where kingship descended is remembered as pre-flood, but the archaeology shows continuous pre-Sumerian occupation, then what does first actually mean? It means the first that we have written records for. It means the first in Sumerian memory. It does not mean the first settlement, the first temple, or the first time human beings organized around sacred architecture in southern Mesopotamia. It means the first we can name in a king list, built on older sacred ground we can see in the strata, but cannot fully interpret because the work of excavation and analysis remains unfinished. History stops where digging stops. We know what has been excavated, we do not know what remains beneath the 18th layer at virgin soil. We do not know if there are older structures below the Ubaid temples. We do not know what pre-Ubaid occupation might look like at a site that Sumerian tradition places before the flood. We do not know because no one has gone back to look with modern methods, modern dating techniques, or the kind of sustained interdisciplinary effort that a site of this importance deserves. The flood memory embedded in the King List raises questions the archaeology has not yet answered. If Eridu is remembered as pre-flood, and if the deeper strata represent older phases of occupation, Are we looking at the material remains of what Mesopotamian tradition remembered as an earlier world? Are the Ubaid layers the archaeology of flood memory? We do not know. The answer is in the ground. The site is still there. Eridu matters because it makes beginning provisional. It suggests that every foundation we identify is built on earlier foundations we have not yet reached. The first city, in Sumerian memory, was already a stack of older sacred constructions. The place where kingship descended was already ancient when kingship arrived. The origin point contains older origin points layered beneath it, waiting. Someone needs to go back to Tell Abu Shahrain and finish what Safar and Lloyd started in the 1940s. The stratigraphic sequence has been documented but not fully analysed. The deepest Ubaid layers have been reached but not dated with modern techniques. The question of what lies beneath the 18th stratum, whether there is pre-Ubaid occupation, whether the site extends deeper into the Neolithic, whether the ground that Sumerian texts call the first city rests on even older sacred memory, remains open. The first city is still there, the mound is still there, the layers are still there, waiting. And the question of what first means when the foundation is already layered with older beginnings has been waiting for 75 years for someone to take it seriously enough to answer.